Minister of Agriculture, and Eleni Galanis from the BC Centre for Disease Control. They're going to be speaking to us about the anthrax case in northern BC.
Thanks, Aaron, for stealing our thunder. So we'd like to tell you the story about this disease outbreak in a northern BC bison herd, which ended up turning into a One Health event. So this herd had been expanding, and in the fall of 2018 was at about 160 head. Due to drought as well as grasshoppers, they were facing a feed storage, which is not unusual in that area. And so they bought red fescue hay, which they typically have fed in the past to try and prevent the animals from becoming over-conditioned. And this was locally produced and purchased hay. So October 8th, they were short on feed. They rolled out 8 bales. These are large round bales, be about 12,000 pounds of hay. Was fed to the animal. The hay looked good, but the animals felt otherwise and seemed reluctant to eat it. 2 days later, the first bison, cow, died. A couple days later, they put out about another 15,000 pounds of hay, again fed on the ground. And a couple days later, a dozen animals were now dead, sudden deaths. About half of the hay was left uneaten again, and the producer felt this was atypical and became suspicious of the hay, so proceeded to burn the hay that was on the ground, put some new hay over top of the burnt hay, and called the veterinarian. The local veterinarian arrived the next day. There were 2 new dead animals located across a dry creek. So he examined those carcasses. The first carcass externally was still warm and stiff, unopened, and a little bit of blood on the external genitalia. And when he tried to express some blood or fluid from a cut on the tip of the ear, it was unsuccessful. And he noticed frothy blood in the animal's nostrils. On opening the animal, there was excessive fluid under the skin of the throat area. The lungs were heavy and congested with blood. The air pipe was full of foam, and there was blood congestion of both the kidneys and liver. The second animal was cold, no longer in rigor, and the contents of the chest cavity internally looked similar to the first animal, with the addition of free blood in the chest cavity. The veterinarian's tentative diagnosis was atypical interstitial pneumonia, and tissues were collected for bacteriology, as well as submitted tissues for examination under the microscope to try and aid in the diagnosis. The samples were then shipped to the Animal Health Center lab in Abbotsford. During that time, the farm suffered another loss. The samples arrived on a Friday in the middle of October, and the laboratory scientists proceeded to process those samples. On arriving in the lab Saturday morning, the laboratory scientists recognized that the culture plates were unusual looking, and our multitop, which is an automated system for identifying bacteria, was unable to identify the bacteria. So the lab staff undertook a number of ancillary tests to try and identify the bacteria. These included DNA sequencing. That proved to be inconclusive. The sequencing suggested there could equally be a chance of half a dozen different bacteria. Those included the bacteria that causes anthrax, which was unusual because BC does not have anthrax. And there was also another closely related bacteria, Bacillus cereus, which is typically not a cause for concern in an animal health perspective. They also conducted a US Navy test kit, and that came back suspect positive. And that was on Sunday. So Monday morning, our laboratory scientists contacted their colleagues at the Public Health Lab at the BC Centre for Disease Control and asked if they would be willing to test the samples using their PCR test for anthrax. They agreed. The samples were sent that day, and late Monday, they confirmed the animals had anthrax. So the farm was informed of this diagnosis, and they underwent a self-quarantine. The farm continued to face additional deaths in the following days. The end of October, a couple days before Halloween, it took 2 days, but the herd all of the remaining animals were vaccinated against anthrax. On November 2nd, the veterinarian attended again at the owner's request. There were 4 animals that again died, showing the very typical signs for anthrax of blood coming out of pretty well all the orifices of the animals. At the owner's urging, the veterinarian sampled these animals, and those swabs were sent to a different animal health laboratory, and the request was to confirm the diagnosis of anthrax. That laboratory cultured each swab and cultured anthrax from each of the swabs and confirmed the diagnosis. On November 6th, the final animal died. In total, there was 26 animals died from this herd, or roughly 1 in 6. Ultimately, the source of the anthrax is unknown, but it is thought to be unlikely that the hay was the source, and it is suspected that the soil on the bison farm was in fact the source of the spores. And over to Eleni.
Thanks, Brian. And I'm presenting on behalf of my 2 medical health officer colleagues who couldn't attend today from the north and from Fraser. But just to add to this story, obviously we were concerned about the potential exposure of humans to anthrax spores, anthrax bacteria during this investigation. So as a reminder, or perhaps as a primer for some of us, there are 3 forms of human anthrax infection. The most common is cutaneous. In fact, over 80% of human cases of anthrax infection present with a cutaneous infection or lesion, and that is transmitted through unprotected, non-intact skin contact. So a person already has cuts on their hands or their skin, or in the process of necropsy or other interventions will cut themselves, and if infected by infected materials, can develop itchiness at the site of the contact, and then a painless lesion, which can look like this black eschar here. If this goes untreated, it can develop into blood infection, sepsis, and potentially death. But it is very highly treatable. The most severe and dramatic form of human infection is pulmonary anthrax, and this is caused by the inhalation of aerosolized spores of anthrax. It causes about 15 to 20% of human infections. And it presents as a pulmonary infection with cough, chest pain, shortness of breath, fever, and it can lead to respiratory failure and death if untreated. And in fact, a large proportion of these people can die. So this is the form that you see with aerosolized or powder form of anthrax that has been used in bioterrorism events. And then gastrointestinal form is the rarest form of anthrax infection in humans, and it's caused by the ingestion of contaminated raw meat from anthrax-infected animals. It happens extremely rarely in developed countries, but can happen somewhat frequently, up to 15% of cases in more developing countries. And it leads to vomiting, abdominal pain, fever, and can also lead to death if untreated. So, all this to say that anthrax can be fatal and therefore is of high concern to human health. So we were concerned particularly about the 1 farmer and the 2 veterinary staff who attended to the sick animals on the farm. They all had unprotected skin contact with carcass and fluids of the infected animals. We decided with the local medical health officer to provide them with chemoprophylaxis, so antibiotic prophylaxis, which initially we were planning to provide them for 60 days. So we did have public health guidelines that we developed about 5 to 8 years ago that are found online, and we hadn't really differentiated between these various forms and the differential risk of the human anthrax forms, and therefore we had blanketed if someone's exposed to anthrax, put them on 60 days of antibiotics. So this is what we started off with for these 3 people who were exposed at the farm. And we also drew blood to assess whether they would serologically convert, whether they were truly exposed to anthrax. It turns out that they did not serologically convert, therefore they had not been exposed to anthrax, and none of them, they were put on symptom watch, and none of them developed symptoms. You can see here that we actually discontinued the chemoprophylaxis for these 3 individuals after 10 days. And that's because during this investigation, myself and a medical resident who was working with me at the time, conducted an intensive literature search to see, well, is this reasonable? Or is this overkill? Because when we spoke to our colleagues across Canada, particularly in provinces where they see more naturally occurring or animal anthrax, the practice was extremely varied, but in general, they did not put people on 60 days of antibiotics, and we therefore discontinued after 10 days because the incubation period for cutaneous anthrax is at the most 3 weeks. They were at the laboratory where the samples were initially received, where the tissues were received and the samples were worked up. There was protected contact with the samples, but unprotected contact with the culture. So there was some concern that some laboratory workers may have been exposed through inhalation to anthrax spores. So they, in fact, were put appropriately so on prophylaxis for 60 days because the incubation period for inhalational anthrax can be that long. And thankfully, their serologies were also drawn, and they were also non-reactive, and none of them developed symptoms. So this led us, all this work, both the investigation of the exposed people, as well as this extensive lit review and speaking to our colleagues across the country, led us to adjust our BC guidelines in case this ever happens again. The 2 things that I wanted to point out was that, one, despite the fact that that anthrax is endemic in animals, particularly in certain parts of the world, in Canada, in the prairie provinces, and now in northern BC, northeastern BC, there have been very, very, very few human cases of anthrax that have occurred following contact with infected animals. And all of them, except one, in developed countries, have been cutaneous anthrax. So really, the risk of inhalational anthrax after animal exposure is practically nil. The only case report ever described is actually in a Canadian who was a backhoe worker who had worked on one of the anthrax outbreaks in animals in the prairies several decades ago, and he had spent many days and hours working under his backhoe, cleaning out the various engines, and believed that he may have been exposed to anthrax spores. But everybody else either was not infected or had a cutaneous infection. And so we really downgraded our guidelines to be more in line with that evidence and with more recently published WHO guidelines, so that if someone's exposed to an infected animal, the risk is only cutaneous anthrax. They don't need to be prophylaxed. They don't need serology, but they do need to be watched for symptoms for 3 weeks to ensure that if they do develop a cutaneous lesion, that they are treated immediately. If someone may be exposed to anthrax in a laboratory setting, in an industrial setting where they're working with wool or hides, or in a bioterrorism setting where there is the possibility of inhalational exposure, those people are at higher risk of infection, and particularly pulmonary infection, and they should be watched for 60 days and put on antibiotic prophylaxis and consider serology to assess whether indeed they have been exposed and they require additional treatment. And those updated guidelines can now be found online. Oh, still me. Brian and others attended a joint public health and animal health town hall following this investigation in the community that was affected by this outbreak. And this was to respond to concerns by the community, both the citizens of this town as well as the producers and others who were directly or indirectly affected. And over 100 producers attended, as well as community members. And it was interesting that the producers were interested in learning more about the disease and about the risk to their herds, whereas the community members really had in mind anthrax as a bioterrorism agent. And this was the line of questioning and of concern that they had. So if you have to deal with this in the future in your communities, be aware that both of these concerns and types of questions may be coming to you. And then finally, I wanted to underscore the important mental health impacts that such an event can have on producers, particularly the farmers that have had an affected herd. And we might hear more about this later on in some of the other presentations, that significant animal loss can occur, that this will have a financial impact on that farmer, a producer, and potentially the greater community. And there's a social impact whereby people, the owners of these affected herds, can be shunned or blamed for these events. And so it's important to keep this in mind when we're caring for these communities.
Yeah, and to underscore some of those losses, the loss of these 26 animals, even in today's market, which the price of bison is quite low, that would be worth at least $50,000. And easily that could be worth double that depending on when you actually price those animals that died. And of course then the farmer would also face the additional cost of the feed, which he had to replace, the cost of carcass disposal, as well as paying for the veterinarian. So these outbreaks can be quite costly, and the social impact is very real. In this case, the producers were concerned that, well, I guess the affected producer was somewhat stigmatized as they did something wrong and they were at cause for this outbreak, and or there was concern for their neighbors that the disease was going to be spread from this particular producer to his neighbors, and those are largely unfounded concerns. As Eleni mentioned, until we hit this outbreak, we didn't think we had anthrax in BC. It's recognized as being endemic in the prairies as well as in northern Canada. But among the industry, veterinarians as well as producers, we really didn't have any collective knowledge or memory of anthrax. After this, if you looked hard enough in the literature, we could find a 50-year-old report from the federal government citing cases of anthrax in BC in the early 20th century, and the most latest case had been 1962, so over 50 years ago. And so a good reminder that sometimes unusual things do happen, and we need to keep those in the back of our mind and maybe be a little more willing to accept those. So this last slide, just wanted to show you the life cycle of anthrax from an animal health perspective. So starting in the bottom center of the slide, we recognize that anthrax spores occur in soil where they can be extremely resistant and hardy, lasting for years, if not decades. Typically, there'll be some sort of inciting event which brings the spores, we think, to the surface and more accessible by the animals. And that could be flooding or soil disturbances such as digging. Once an animal ingests soil, it's contaminated with the anthrax spore, the spore sporulates into a vegetative form that disseminates throughout the animal's body and produces toxins which result in the clinical signs. Typically, we think it's about a week or two from the time the animal consumes the spores until they start to show the clinical signs. Often they'll be dead then within a few hours. They are quite amenable to treatment in that you don't need to use very powerful antibiotics. Oxytetracycline, penicillin G will often work quite nicely. The challenge, though, is that the animals may not be alive very long to see that they're ill and treat them, and antibiotic treatment can interfere with subsequent vaccination. Once the animal dies, as long as the carcass is not opened, vegetative form remains in the vegetative form and is very susceptible to dying. So simply the process of the carcass decomposing and in the process heating up will be enough to kill those bacteria. Unfortunately, if the carcass is opened, whether that be through human intervention or scavenging, the vegetative form, once exposed to air, turns into the spores. And of course, any leakage of the carcass will potentially result in environmental contamination around the carcass. And then the spores again enter the soil, largely become dormant and resistant, and lay there dormant for potentially, as we've seen in this case, a number of years. So this life cycle underscores a couple things. One, that the disease, a cow that's sick with anthrax does not pose a risk to other animals. It is only through the environmental consumption of the spores that an animal becomes infected. And the other important point is the importance of carcass management. We would prefer these carcasses not to be opened. and carcass disposal. And so at any rate, these carcasses should be disposed of properly, which typically takes the form of either incineration or deep burial. And that includes then also appropriately treating any environmental contamination that occurred. Yeah, and so I think that's it for our presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions, and we acknowledge the work of all the people that who were involved in this case, both from the producer, the attending veterinarian, as well as all the staff, both in animal health and public health.
Great, thanks. Do we have any questions? We have time for probably 2 questions. I see one over here.
I was just curious if there was a protocol for environmental decontamination.
We recommended simply they follow what has been in the CFIA guidelines. So again, as much of this contaminated soil as possible should be disposed of with the carcasses. So in this case, they burned the carcasses, and then use of either lye or bleach or sodium hydroxide to treat the contaminated soil, as well as any materials, for example, the heavy equipment that were in contact with the carcasses or any leakage.
Any other questions?
Try this again with my big, ugly voice. Thanks, Kate, for asking that. I was going to ask that too. Epidemiologically, do you have any reason to suspect what the source was from topographical features, flooding, disturbance of the soil, anything like that, Brian?
No, on the bison farm, and as far as that goes, including the local farm that produced the hay, they reported no history of flooding, no history of soil disturbances.
How long had bison been on that property, or any bovid?
I beg your pardon?
How long had bison or any bovid been on that property? Was it a new farm?
No, this is an existing farm, and up in that area of northern BC, there is a lot of ranching goes on, extensive ranching.
So just the only other feature I think you kind of missed was the wildlife involvement, and we do have free-ranging wood bison herds in that area.
Okay.
So there was quite a lot of concern in the conservation community that this disease would spread to wood bison, because it is present in wood bison populations in other parts of Canada. To my knowledge, I never did see the location of that farm, but is it in any kind of close contact, potential contact with the wood bison herds?
Don't know. I guess we'd have to sit down and look at the map.
Yeah.
Great. I think that's all for questions. So thank you, Eleni and Brian. Appreciate that.